night may be long and the dark may be deep, but the answers are there to be found. Whether it's the normal, the abnormal, or the paranormal, you're in the right place. Let's go beyond reality.
Welcome to the program. Great to have you along tonight. I'm your host, J.V. Johnson. And we have a good show lined up for you. I've noticed this, and this is completely unintentional. It just happens to be the way current events are driving some of the things that we're talking about. And one of the things we wanted to chat about is how the global warming or climate change discussion is impacted by the coronavirus discussion, because there is a convergence here. And so we have a guest tonight that's going to do that and talk about climate change facts as well. I don't mean to get too political on the program. It just seems like a lot of these topics have a political edge to them. So I'll ask that if politics bothers you a little bit, that you be patient. But these are interesting things to talk about, whether you agree, disagree. It doesn't really matter. It's all about having a good, honest, solid discussion. And that's what we're going to do here tonight with Gregory Wrightstone. He's a geologist. He has written a book that's called Inconvenient Facts. Also, YouTube is a great place for you to join us. We live stream there. We also have a chat room that is live during the live broadcasts, and it's just J.V. Johnson on YouTube as well. And, of course, the podcast is Beyond Reality Paranormal, and you can find the podcast on any major podcast distribution platform. Sorry, just being distracted a little bit by chat. Anyway, thank you for being in the chat room. If you've joined us there, there's a bunch of people there already, and I'm very happy and pleased to see you all. Looking forward to a great discussion tonight. It's Beyond Reality, and we'll be right back. Please support the program. Go to patreon.com/Johaw. That's Johaw. Gregory Wrightstone is a geologist. He's author of a book called Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. His website is inconvenientfacts.xyz. Greg, welcome to Beyond Reality. Great to have you with us tonight.
No, good to be on with you, too. It's I talk a lot about climate change, and there's always something new every week that's crazy and bizarre. This week does not lack in that at all.
Well, we like crazy, we like bizarre, and we like to talk about issues, particularly if they have a little bit of controversy associated with them, which this one certainly does. But before we get into that, I don't know where you are in the country, maybe Pittsburgh, I'm not sure, but are you in a hot zone with this virus stuff, or are you relatively okay?
It's warm. It's in terms of the COVID,
yeah.
But I did attend our rally yesterday in Pittsburgh that was held here, protesting our leftist governor's totalitarian overreach for government regulations on the COVID-19 shutdown. And my sign on the side of my truck said, "I'd rather live on my feet or rather die on my feet than live on my knees." And my wife and I, it was thousands of protesters downtown of Pittsburgh rallying to open up our state, and it's going on across the United States.
You know, this is an interesting discussion to me. We had somebody on a couple nights ago talking about this specifically. I mean, I think most Americans are a bit torn on how to feel about this. You know, on one hand, they certainly don't want to be forfeiting their constitutionally guaranteed rights, which they are. But secondly, they feel that there's an obligation to respect authority in a particularly dangerous, as they see it, time. How do we reconcile these two thoughts, these two ideas?
Yeah. There's you want to respect people, but I think it could be done better by protecting those that are vulnerable, rather than and protect them, restrict maybe keep them safe, but not protect and infringe on the freedoms of people that really have extremely low chances of mortality. And we're going to learn a lot in the coming months about what the true mortality rate is, and if that true mortality rate is on the order of, it's looking like it's decreasing every time they release the numbers. I'm not trying to play it down. I've written a lot of commentaries recently, and I think I've posted 5 or 6 commentaries over the last 30 days on my website, which is inconvenientfacts.xyz. So your listeners could go and look at what I've written about. And a lot of what I look at it from a scientist and as a geologist in my book, I write, and I've written in my book concerning mortality and heat and mortality and climate. And there's a really, really strong relationship between mortality and climate, and that it's just opposite of what we're being told by the media. And the media tells us, oh my God, we can't allow it to get a degree or degree and a half warmer. We're all going to die. There's going to be famine and heat-related deaths. But in reality, what we find, the science, the facts, and the data, and I say that a lot, show us that cold-related deaths outnumber heat-related deaths by an order of 15 to 20 to 1. The largest study ever done on temperature-related mortality was done by a team led by Dr. Antonio Gasparini. They looked at 74 million temperature-related deaths around the Earth, and they found in this study that 20 times as many people die due to cold-related deaths as due to heat-related deaths. Another study looking at the UK and Australia, that it was 15 times as many people died due to cold as due to heat. So, and that has a lot to do. Some of the early studies that came out about COVID and coronavirus, dating back 30, 45 days. The first one I looked at they looked at coronaviruses and found that the other coronaviruses, they haven't looked at this one yet. We don't know. We'll find out. The other coronaviruses were strongly seasonal. The seasonality of the coronavirus. In other words, they ranged from November to April, and then as we got into the late spring and summer months, they went away. And my commentary on that was about the possible light at the end of the warming light at the end of the tunnel for coronavirus. And the most likely scenario is that this coronavirus, COVID-19, will go ahead and explore. It'll be the same as what the other coronaviruses are. That's the most likely scenario. It would be extremely unlikely if this thing has a completely different non-seasonal component to it. And so wouldn't that be great to find out that here as we go into May that it just kind of goes away? We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen. But that would be good. Of course, that sets us up for possibility of coming back in the fall. One thing we can look at, for example, Australia in the southern hemisphere is now going into their autumn, their fall months, and we're not seeing an onset of additional coronavirus. Australia, yes, they did get an outbreak in Australia during their summer, but it was at the end of their summer when people were returning from traveling around the world and returning to Australia. So that would be, it's one of the things I look at. And again, in my book, I've a chapter there was called Heat and Life, Cold and Death. And I've one of my commentaries recently was related to that. So yes, there's this strong link between temperature and mortality, and it's just, again, the opposite of what we're being told.
Yeah, we're going to explore that idea in a little more detail as our discussion goes on. But sticking with this coronavirus discussion, we often are told that sunlight, fresh air, warmth, summer months will kill off this type of infectious disease. You know, we see that with flu season, although sadly flu keeps coming back year after year. However, what we're being told by our authorities right now is not to go outside, not to get fresh air, stay inside. It seems as though it's almost counterproductive advice.
Yeah, and it's, again, I wrote another commentary very similar to this, and there was a study concerning that, and it was this was written a decade or more ago, concerning the benefits and why we see a lot of these things go away. And a lot of it has to do with vitamin D. And vitamin D, you can take pills, but most people get their vitamin D from sunlight. And we stay indoors through the winter months, and it's when you go out. This study correlated and had a strong linkage between sunlight, not so much fresh air, but getting out. And it only takes somewhere 10, 15 minutes of sunlight to get the minimum amounts of vitamin D that you accrue by sunlight on your skin. And this study correlated that with the prevalence of the getting rid of the cold, viruses and flu and things like that. So that has a lot to do with it. So my advice is go get some sunlight. And in fact, it was crazy. I'm taking care of myself. I have just tell you, I got psoriatic arthritis. So I was on an immunosuppressant. And with this coronavirus, I said, it's probably not a good thing to be on. That would be a significant risk factor if I got it.
Sure.
And I got off of it. Went to the dermatologist, and she said, you know what you need to do? Go lay in the sun. Go out in your backyard, lay in the sun. This is a dermatologist telling me to lay in the sun. And she says it'd be good for you for a number of reasons. And who would have thought that a dermatologist was going to tell you to go lay in the sun to get some sunshine? But that was her recommendation. And so this is something that your listeners should appreciate, that the health effects of, and there's vitamin D also has a very fortifying effect in terms of fighting cancer and other things.
And, I think that the sun and being in the sun has got a bit of a bad rap as of late. And I don't want to diminish the fact that there are dangers of getting too much sun, but I think we may have tipped the scales too much in the other direction. We need to get a little bit of sunlight. Not just does the vitamin D help us physiologically, but helps us mentally as well.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting. I've looked at that. A lot of when we talk about skin cancer, a lot of those cancers arise in places, or often in places where you don't get any sun exposure, between your toes, under your armpits. They're places that you just don't get sun where the skin cancer arises. And so I'm certainly no expert and don't want to go into that, but if I have a dermatologist telling me to go out and get some sun, I think that's I was actually shocked when I got that.
One thing you are an expert in is geology. You're a geologist. Let's talk a little bit about how you decided to make that a career path. At what point did science appeal to you to the point where you pursued it that seriously? Yeah,
it started, actually I was in fourth grade. My grandmother was eclectic, if we shall say. If she was younger, she would have been a hippie. And she was into all kinds of stuff, and she had found, I'm not sure how she found it, there was a close to, they were farmers. My grandfather was a farmer, and she found a fossil collecting spot not far from our place, and took me there. We'd go fossil collecting, and it was fantastic, just beautiful trilobites, and all sorts of bryozoans and all kinds of things. And I learned she helped me with trying to figure out what everything was, and that's when I first decided that I had this love for geology. And then I found out that, and that's what I did. I went into it, and I've had a successful career. I got into the petroleum industry. rose up through, actually went through the equity funding process for a large energy company. I was one of the founding partners there, and I divorced myself from all of that when I started into this book, and I got to tell you, I did not set out to write a book. I set out the book is the result of my personal search for the truth, because I was told various different things, and I didn't know what to believe. Just like you and your listeners, we're given competing, conflicting information about climate change. And, is it getting colder? Is it getting warmer? Is the ice increasing, decreasing? Is it too much rain, not enough rain? Too much snow, not enough snow? And I said, man, I dove into this research as to what climate change was. And I said, I'm going to look at the base data, which is what I did. And I just was horrified by what I found, and shocked, and actually enraged by the lies that were being told about so many things about climate change. And it's an abuse of the scientific process is what I found, and that's what enraged me the most, was this. I said, I have to do something. And it was that search for the truth. And I did this. I gave a presentation at our local geological society about my findings. And it was that night that I said, you know what? And it was a packed house, double the attendance. People were just thirsty for this information. And it was that night I said, I'm going to turn this and turn this into a book. And it was, I need to expose this and the climate lies of what we're being told. And I'm not a science denier. I accept that it's warming. I accept that carbon dioxide is increasing, and it's because of our burning of fossil fuels. But what I found through my research, in which I capture in my book, and my next book that I'm working on now is going to more fully explore that, is that the combination of the modest rise in temperature that we've seen it started 300 years ago, this modest rise in temperature, combined with an increase in CO2, is leading to an Earth that's prospering and thriving. By almost every metric you look at, life is better. Ecosystems are thriving and improving. Completely opposite of what we're being told. We're being told that, aren't we, that just everything we look at is just getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And it's just not so. It's just not so. And what they need to do is impose this climate of fear, which is what the mainstream media, the UN, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, AOC, Al Gore, they all want to further this climate of fear, of this looming apocalypse, one after the other, of droughts, of floods, of increasing toenail fungus, you name it. That's what they want you to believe is happening, and it's not. It's not. What they're doing is using failed climate models, just as we've seen the models for COVID-19 have been complete failures with over-prediction. They're doing the same thing with climate models, over-predicting warming and predicting. They're saying, oh my God, this is what's going to happen 30, 50, or 80 years in the future. And I'm a climate realist. I look at what's actually happening today and say, no, the Earth is thriving, prospering, and greening, and humanity's benefiting from our changing climate, not getting worse.
So there's so many questions from what you just said. I'm not sure where to start, other than let's start.
There's a lot there. There's a lot there that I threw out, but go ahead. Yes.
Let's start with the messengers, the Al Gores of the world, the AOCs of the world, people that would if they had their way, legislate to control almost every part of our lives based on what they call climate change science. Do they believe what they're saying, or are they just using it as an excuse?
Yeah, that's. I get similar questions a lot. Some do actually believe this. There are others are using it as an agenda. For example, there was a webinar April 2nd. It was aired. It was put on by the Society of Environmental Journalists, the SEJ, and one of the panelists there was a senior fellow for, are you ready for it? The Council on Foreign Relations, the CFR. You know them, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You know this is a one world globalist, Rockefeller-funded group, and they want, and are not very silent about it. They want globalist government, and that's what her big thing was in this panel was. The webinar was on how do we talk about climate change in an age of COVID-19, and her big point was, well, we've got these, both COVID-19 and climate change are global problems. And because of that, we need global solutions. We need to work globally to solve these problems. And I just went, it sent chills up my spine. She was just talking about how we need to work globally for this. No, we don't. No, we don't. No, thank you. Donald Trump, thank you, he got us out of the Paris Climate Accord, thank God. He's working very well to keep us away from enacting stupid, idiotic, economically crippling regulations like the Green New Deal or the Paris Climate Accord. But these people, so when we're talking about what are their motivations, for her it was pretty clear. She wants a global governance. Other people, another that was on the panel was Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who is she's a doctor of climatology, but appropriately she's in the political science department. Which is, that's if you're going to be a climate alarmist, you got to be in the political science, not anywhere dealing with actual science. And what I'm hesitating here because I have to hesitate because my main goal in talking about this is dealing with the science and not the politics, because too often we talk about, if we get into the politics of this, which I know you would love to do, but it almost sounds like you have to put on a tinfoil hat, that there's this global conspiracy, maybe there is, of leaders and scientists and everybody around the world that's trying to push this fake narrative of global warming. And when I'm asked those questions, what you just asked, what you're saying is, to rephrase it, is, why are they lying to us? And I always tell people my main response to that is that you and every one of your listeners are just as qualified to tell me why they're doing it as what I am. Because I don't know.
Yeah.
What I can do, I can provide what I see my role in this discussion is providing, as a scientist, to provide the science, the facts, and the data that says they are lying to you, and you can make up your own mind as why they're lying to you. And we can go through, as we go through here tonight, there will be a number of these, what I call the big climate hoaxes, the recent climate hoaxes, extinction events. Just 2 days ago, a report on mega droughts, on how the worst droughts of thousands of years are occurring now in the southwest United States, which is completely false. How fires are increasing in California. They're not. They're declining. Things like that. We'll talk about that as we go through here, and it's important from that's what I see as my role is providing the science that tells you they're lying to you, and rather, I'll let you and your listeners decide why they're lying.
Well, let me ask this question, and this may fall right into the same category that you're kind of packaging right now. But how and why has this become an issue that seems to be divided along political lines? It seems as though, you can look at quote unquote the science, whether you're Republican, Democrat, or independent or whatever, and you may see value in it or you may not. But for some reason, this is largely divided among political lines. Do we have any understanding of why it happens that way?
Yeah, it's fascinating, but you're exactly right. Most conservatives are skeptical. Most progressives and liberals just buy into this global warming catastrophic opinion. It's fascinating, and I'd like to think maybe conservatives are, well, I'll be damning the progressives, and maybe they do. Well, maybe they deserve to be damned before it. But they're yes. But you're exactly right. There is a spectrum of the camp and the progressive elements buying into climate change, and it could be this climate change argument when we talk about the political aspects is, or are they? Do they really want to advance this, or do they want to destroy the economy? Yeah. Do they want to destroy America over this?
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I'm not so sure.
Maybe that's one of the overarching goals of this.
I'm not so sure. I don't know. I'm not so sure. And maybe I'm just going to give them the benefit of the doubt that it's destroying is their objective. I think it's more of a control issue than anything else. But let's talk about climate change. When first of all, we were talking about global warming for a very long time, and suddenly, and for some reason, the debate shifted. It was no longer global warming; it was now climate change. So, what if if somebody had just landed here from Mars and said, "I heard this phrase, climate change"? What would we be talking about?
Yeah, let's talk first about what I believe.
Okay.
And in terms of climate change, I believe climate's changing. It always does. I'm a geologist. We know the thing that would be surprising to anybody would be is if it's not changing.
Exactly.
If it's not, then that would be a truly odd coincidence that it wasn't changing. And what I believe is that, yes, we're in a warming period. It's been warming. It started in the late 17th century, late 1600s.
Can I interrupt you just for a second? Because I want to ask this question because it relates to this. Hasn't it really been warming for, what was the last ice age, 25,000 years ago? Hasn't it really been warming that whole time?
No, it hasn't, actually. There's the end of the last ice age occurred some 11,000 years ago. And that's when it really, the peak in the warming began. That's when we got out of the 11,000 or so, 12,000 years ago. It really started drastic warming. And we're in the interglacial period now. And it was in the period 6,000 to 9,000 years ago. It was called the Holocene Optima. And remember, this is a key point for your listeners. It was called an optima. That was the high point of the warming, 6,000 to 9,000 years ago, and it was called an optima. These warming periods were called optima for a good reason, because it was beneficial to both the Earth's ecosystems, and to humanity. These warming periods were very beneficial. We had the Roman optima, the medieval optima. We've got the current warming period we're in right now. And so again, we started warming. It was actually the depths of what was called the Little Ice Age in the late 1600s. It was horrific, and we've been warming for 300 years, more or less, in fits and starts. It warms for 30 or 40 years, and then might cool a little bit, but then it warms up some more. Right now, we're in a period of about 20 years where it hasn't really warmed at all. It's called the pause, and we don't know what's going to happen from here on out. No one does. If they tell you do, then you should. I don't know what's going to happen. I think I do. What I do is I look back through Earth's history and say, okay, this is what's happened before. As a geologist, I can look at that, and I said, and it's probably going to repeat. So, if looking at the other warming periods that we've had in the past, I believe that we'll continue to have warming for another period of time, whatever that period is. Is it 50 years or 100 years or 150 years? I don't know. But at some point it's going to cool down again, just like it always does. And the big takeaway on all this is the strong correlation. And this is what my next book is going to deal a lot with, is the strong correlation between the rise and fall of temperature and the rise and fall of civilizations. And in each case, what we've seen is the previous warming periods that we've seen, as these were warm periods that were warmer than they are today. And each one of those warm periods was associated with just tremendous advances of civilizations and technology, and great empires rose up, and civilizations rose up, and food was bountiful and plentiful in these warm periods. And if you were in each one of those periods, if you were living in that time, you didn't have to wonder or worry about how you're going to feed your family tomorrow or next week or next month or next year, because food was bountiful in the warm periods. And so that gave you time to people to tinker, to dream, to sculpt, to invent. And that's why things grow. And it was the cold periods, the intervening cold periods that went by the names of the Greek Dark Ages, the Dark Ages, and the Little Ice Age. Each one of those cold periods were horrific. It was accompanied by crop failure, famine, pestilence, and mass depopulation, each one of those cold periods. And again, isn't that opposite of what we're being told?
Yeah.
We're being told, oh my God, we can't let it, we have to do something to stop it from warming. Well, no, that's not what history tells us. History tells us is that these warm periods were tremendous for both the Earth's ecosystems and for humanity. And this warm period we're in right now is nothing different. And we should, again, I embrace it. If you look on the back of my SUV, I've got my I Love CO2 bumper sticker, and I've got I Love CO2 T-shirts. And in fact, we're going to be I'm building a new website right now. We're going to be offering my T-shirts and bumper stickers and ball caps, my I Love CO2 paraphernalia, because I'm a huge proponent of the many benefits of carbon dioxide increases, and it's just completely contrary to what we're being told. If we look at CO2, CO2 has so many benefits to I'm sure you've got a smart listener base that they realize that increasing CO2 is a plant food and it benefits crops. In my book, I capture that information from Dr. Craig Idso and his team. They looked at laboratory experiments, or actually their greenhouse experiments, and an increase of 300 parts per million of CO2 would lead to an average 46% increase in crop growth. And that he looked at the 95% of the crops grown on Earth. That's a good thing. That's a really, 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 really good thing, that we could feed the hungry, we could feed a lot more people, and we could deal with the rising population base just by the increase in CO2. And the other benefit of CO2 increase is that plants don't require as much water with rising CO2, and that's because they don't. It's called the transpiration process. In other words, the breathing in and out. Plants suck in through their stomata or pores. They suck in the air, which includes CO2, and convert it in the photosynthesis process and expel oxygen. Well, because they don't need as much of this, and when they're expelling this, they're also expelling water vapor. So, because they're not expelling it as much, they don't need as much, and they're not sucking as much out of the ground. So it leaves increased soil moisture because of increased CO2. And again, that's partly driving a decrease in forest fires. It's partly decreasing droughts around the world because of an increased soil moisture content.
Greg, what are the natural factors that affect warming and cooling on the planet? Obviously, the sun is a huge part of that, but talk a little bit about the sun's effects and how important that is, and then some of the other things that happen here on Earth that affect. And this, I'm not talking about man-made things. I'm talking about natural occurrences.
Yeah, there's the big drivers that drive glacial advances and retreats. They're called Milankovitch cycles. There are three of these things that drive. It's the wobble of the Earth, the eccentricity of the Earth's orbit, and things like that drive the really big changes. We're pretty sure about that. That's pretty much without dispute, that those are the big drivers of these big cycles. Now, what we want to talk about. Remember, I said that the last glacial period ended about 11,000 years ago.
Yep.
And since that time, we've seen temperature going up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down and up and down. And those, not in as much significant as what the big glacial cycles. The big glacial, there might be a 15 or 20 degree Fahrenheit change between the cold of the glacial periods and the warmth of what we're in right now. But here in this cycle, what we're talking about, the last 10,000 or so years, going up and down, up and down and down. A lot of people, there's a lot of work that confirms that it's probably due to solar fluctuations. I'm not arrogant enough to tell you that I know exactly what it is. I read a lot of material from respected people that say it's the solar influences that change it. And I'm going to tell you, I just don't know. I don't know. And it's okay to say that.
Sure.
It's okay to say I don't know. Because I've seen, I read a lot, and people advance various philosophies. I do know that what I can say is I'm pretty doggone sure it's not related to CO2, which is that's the big thing we need to decide. Is our increases in increases in CO2 from the burning of fossil fuels, are they what's driving the increase in CO2? Is that what's driving our the degree or degree and a half of centigrade temperature increase that we've seen over the last 100 or so years? And I don't think it is, because it's the increase that we've seen in the modern period. It looks very similar to the increases that we've seen throughout time over the last 10,000 years. We've seen 9 other warming trends very similar to what we're in right now, and those weren't driven by man-made increases in CO2. 5 of the 9 other warming periods had higher rates of warming than what we've seen over the last 100 or so years. So this is, and that's the key. What they, in parentheses, or what they want you to believe is that our modern temperatures, the rate of increase of temperature, the current warming that we've seen is unusual and unprecedented. And if we look at it in the geologic, again, I bring the geologic context here. If we look at it, the temperatures we see today are not unusual. They're not unprecedented. It's very similar to what we've seen over the last 10,000 years in terms of changes. We just happen to be in a warming period. Thank God. It brought us out of the death-dealing cold of the Little Ice Age, and are leading to beneficial changes here on Earth. And we see it just about every metric we look at is improving and has been improving.
One of the things I don't think I heard you mentioned, and I've always been under the impression that it is a rather important part of this cycle, is volcanic activity. Doesn't that contribute to Earth's, whether it's cooling, warming, or anything?
Yeah. I just wrote again. I just if your listeners are on LinkedIn, you can go connect with me on LinkedIn. I have a post just last week on volcanism. There have been times through Earth's history where volcanism has impacted the Earth's temperature significantly. This is not one of them. There was a pretty well-known geologist out of Australia it's mostly attributed to him, where he says that one big volcanic eruption will put out as much CO2 as all of Earth's history, and that's factually incorrect. Factually incorrect. That actually volcanism and volcanoes emit somewhere around 1 or 2% of what man's contribution is, and it looks like a lot. A big volcano does put out a lot in one day when it erupts, but it's tiny compared to man's. I don't have the information up here. I tell you what the actual numbers are on this, but it's just not so. And that's confirmed. Again, if you go on my posts, again, if you're on LinkedIn, you could connect with me. There's a figure I show. If we look at the Mauna Loa carbon dioxide levels of concentration in the atmosphere, they go back to 1958. And I've posted, if you look at the 3 largest volcanoes, Chacon, Pinatubo, and another one called Agula, were the 3 largest over the last 40 years. When they erupted, there was zero effect on atmospheric CO2 increase. And if that was the case, that CO. Now, what I will say is, throughout geologic time, there were periods when massive volcanism events occurred. The Russian steppes is a big one. With there was a period that these things, just volcanoes, now these weren't. There are 2 kinds. Am I going too technical with you on this?
No, I think we're good. I think we're okay still. Okay.
So there are 2 kinds of volcanoes. There are explosive volcanoes like Pinatubo, Mount St. Helens. Bam! Man, they send explosive stuff up in the atmosphere tens of thousands of feet, and it's just. And then there are other volcanoes, if you can imagine Kilauea, they're called effusive volcanoes, where they just kind of flow out. The explosive volcanoes cause a cooling effect across the Earth for a number of years, because they're putting a lot of stuff, they're blocking out the sun. But they also put out a lot of things called like chlorine and bromine and CO2. But it's overwhelmed by the cooling effects. These effusive volcanoes put out all the same atmospheric things like bromine, chlorine, and can cause a warming effect. But there were times on Earth when these things just, for whatever reason, the Russian steppes are like that. There are hundreds of meters of magma and lava that covered most of Russia and emitted a huge amount of this. And it's fascinating. I'm looking into this right now. There's a fellow geologist, Peter Ward, that's written a book on this, and he relates that the bromine and chlorine that are emitted along with the CO2 destroy the ozone. And believe it or not, the ozone layer destruction, I thought it was a hoax. It's not. It wasn't. We were harming the ozone layer by emitting a lot of this stuff, and we did something good by not doing by making the changes. But what we do with the ozone layer, when it's destroyed by these chemicals, it allows ultraviolet light to hit the Earth, a lot more of it, which then warms the Earth more. So his theory is during these events that happen periodically through Earth's history, that the ultraviolet light would come down and warm the planet, and that's what his theory. And it's fascinating. I'm not sure if I buy into it completely, but it's a really interesting theory, and that just tells us how much we don't know about climate and what controls temperatures. So there's a lot to be learned yet. I like to explore these theories like that.
Gregory Wrightstone is our guest. He's a geologist. He's got a book. It's called Inconvenient Facts, the science that Al Gore doesn't want you to know. His website is inconvenientfacts.xyz. Greg, that's the first website I've actually come across with that extension, XYZ. Is there something specific about that, or is it just catchy?
No, there was the .com was available. Someone had done it, and I think it was after Al Gore did his book. They reserved it, and it was up for 15 years for someone to. People do that. They reserve a name and hope somebody will buy it from them.
Right.
And they wanted $5,000 for the .com, and I offered them $800, and they said immediately the price went up to $20,000, and I said, "Go pound salt."
Yeah,
I'll
I
do
don't
the
blame you.
XYZ. So
I don't blame you.
It hasn't hurt me because we're getting somewhere between 50 and 60,000 unique visitors a month to the website, because I've got a lot of content there that I post, and we're actually building a new website right now where we'll be offering a lot of our merchandise there, along with some other cool. I'm also doing what I'm calling the Climate Chronicles. It's a live. We're going live on YouTube and Facebook every Thursday night at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And what I'm going to do, it's about a 15-minute segment that I'm going to be doing, and we'll be going through some of the basics of what we're talking about tonight. And in that Climate Chronicles live, I'll be using a lot of figures and charts. And I'm big on empowering people with knowledge and information. And so what we're going to do is on the new website, we're going to be offering a PowerPoint of the figures from each weekly Climate Chronicles segment that I air, and it'll be able, so your listeners will be able to then go get charts. They'll be able to get the information. They'll be able to get a chart that'll show the last 350 years of temperature, the last 12,000 years of temperature, whatever I talk about on that. So we're going through that right now. It's an exciting time, and again, I'm big in empowering people with information. And we had just talked here before the break about the volcanoes. While we were on the break here, I went back and looked. So U.S. about volcanoes, according to the United States Geological Survey, volcanoes emit 200 million tons of CO2 per year, which is a lot, but that's compared to 24 billion tons that's emitted from the use of man's burning of fossil fuels and use of fossil fuels. And again, I don't deny that CO2 is increasing because of fossil fuels, and I'm okay with that. In fact, I'm a big proponent of how beneficial that is. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that people have, and one of the biggest lies, is that we have too much CO2 in the atmosphere, and it's dangerous. We're getting dangerous increases, when in fact, if we look through geologic history, and just let's take a look at what CO2 is right today. CO2, carbon dioxide, is at a little over 400 parts per million in the atmosphere. It's a trace gas, and although it's a trace gas, it's a very important gas. So 400 parts per million, a little bit over. Right now, the average throughout Earth's history, going back to the Precambrian, was 2,600 parts per million, 6.5 times what we are today.
Oh, wow.
And people don't know that. They go, "Wow, that's interesting." And there's an important chart which I can send to you. You need to get this to your listeners and post this at your website.
Okay. Is
the 140 million year decline in carbon dioxide. It's almost a straight line decline from 2,500 parts per million down to where we are today. And viewing that, and in fact, I've got a red line at the bottom of this chart. In your mind's eye, there's a red line at the bottom at 150 parts per million, which is what I call the line of death. That's the minimum threshold for plant life to exist. That would be, we nearly got there at the end of the last ice age.
Did you say 150 parts per million?
150 parts per million. We got to 172 parts per million at the end of the last ice age. We went from 2,500 down to 172. Almost crossed that line of death. Now, that would be a true climate apocalypse, would it not, if we crossed that? So what we have today, we don't have too much CO2. We're actually CO2 impoverished. When the plants that we rely on, most of the plants, are evolved back, plant life, the CO2 was about 2,500 parts per million. So these plants evolved wanting and needing and using higher CO2 levels than they are today. And it just goes to reason, and we show it by laboratory studies that higher CO2 levels increase plant growth. Now, again, I don't want to go too technical on you here, but there are two main groups of plants that we rely on. There are the C3 plants. Those are the ones that evolved back when it was 2,500 parts per million, and they love CO2. And then later, because of much lower CO2 levels, there was this niche that these, what are called C4 plants, corn, maize, some of the grasses, they evolved to survive in a much lower CO2 environment. So they also, the C4 plants like corn, maize, things like that, they also benefit from higher CO2 levels, but not just as much. And so it's fascinating that again, the big story here is is that CO2 levels aren't too high. They're not high enough. We're still CO2 impoverished, and they tell us, well, oh my God, the CO2 levels are. It's not dangerous. The EPA doesn't set limits for in workplaces until it gets to 10,000 parts per million. There's virtually no effects in terms of bad effects of CO2 directly on humans until it gets up to 15,000, 20,000 parts per million. I've had a recent fascinating conversation with an old geezer. I think he's 84, 88, or whatever he is, that had gone through. He was a submariner, and he told some great stories about he transitioned from the diesel subs to the nuclear, and about how sometimes the CO2 levels got so high that it was well in excess of 20,000 parts per million that they would sometimes get headaches, and they'd have to get up to the surface to recycle fresh air in. But again, we're nowhere near that. No one is expecting anything because of that. So no, the big story that if nothing, your listeners don't learn anything else tonight. We're CO2 impoverished. We don't have too much CO2. We don't have enough.
Greg, I have to ask, we talked about politicians, the people who deliver these messages to us and preach to us, and my question about them was, do they believe what they're saying, or are they using it as a tool to get what they want? What about the scientists? I mean, if you believe media headlines, there is a consensus among scientists that we are causing an increase in CO2 levels that will irreparably destroy civilization, or at least much of it, if we don't get it in check. Are they looking at the same data? Are they lying about it? And are they misrepresenting it? Or are they, in fact, convinced of what they're saying?
Yeah, that's where I get... Some are, some aren't.
I mean, it
takes a brave person. It takes a brave person to, and I know because I've experienced it, to stand up and speak out against this. Because again, everyone talks about this so-called consensus, which is I could go on for half an hour on that alone, but there is not a consensus. And let me tell you what, when I speak, I've spoken at many scientific organizations, mostly geologists, and there's a consensus, all right, and the consensus is that they agree with me. Most geologists agree with me, and it's just.
I get the impression there's not necessarily a consensus, but there's a more concerted effort to silence one side.
Oh yeah,
and that's why you hear more of the other.
Yeah, and I've been fortunate. Right now, I've been accepted as an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. I'm an expert reviewer, and I'm part of this. This is the UN. I'm part of the bad guys, but I want to be part of that because I want to have input.
Sure.
They ignore it, but I've been accepted as that, and because of that, I have recently been in a debate. I debated an alarmist professor at Cornell University in November. One of the first times that's happened. They just will not. They don't do it, because what that does is gives me a voice to not promote, but to voice the inconvenient facts that these students don't know and haven't heard, and there were 185 students in that classroom. It was the forensics and debate class where we did it. It wasn't open to the public, but it was there, and it was amazing. The students afterwards came up, and I brought books for every one of them. I said, I'm going to give you each a book. If you want a book, you come get it. And of course, students, they like college students, anything that's free, they love it. And my brother was there, and he was standing. They were all lined up, and as they would come down, I was signing them. He would hand them a book and look at them right in the eye and point at them and say, if you take this book, you have to promise to read it. And they go, okay. And the students, it was empowering, because these students heard things they'd never heard before, and their eyes were opened. They weren't necessarily buying into it, but and that's what I find as I travel around the country. Is back when I was doing it, was just in the airports, wherever I would travel. I've never met anybody that wasn't interested in hearing what I had to say and was just thirsty. People are thirsty for this information that I provide. People are thirsty that you can get from my book, Inconvenient Facts. You go to inconvenientfacts.xyz. We have a smartphone app too. You can go to the App Store, Google Play, to get the smartphone apps. You can have this information. That way, if you're once this is all over and you have Sunday dinner or go out to a dinner with you're there with your idiot nephew Billy. Everybody's got an idiot nephew Billy, right, or somebody like that. And your idiot nephew Billy says, "Oh well, Uncle JB, polar bears are going extinct." You can go, "Wait a minute," and you can pull out your smartphone and you could queue up Inconvenient Fact number 52 and say, "Well, wait a minute, Billy. Here's a chart showing polar bear population for the last 60 years, and it's increasing. What about that, Billy?" And that's the power that this has. That you can have this information right in the palm of your hands. And I find as I travel around, I can pull this out and talk to people about this. And so that's, again, I'm really big on empowering people with information and knowledge. That's one of the big things I want to do.
And you said that's Inconvenient app. That's what it's called.
Yeah, you could Google. You could search for at the App Store, Google Play, Inconvenient app or Inconvenient Facts, and it's. Well, let me tell you a story about that. That's what we wrote. I got a call out of the blue from this guy from Boston, Carl Kowalski, and he says, "Mr. Wrightstone," he says, he introduced himself. He says, "Do you have a smartphone app for your book?" And I said, "No." He says, "Well, I think you're." "Oh, well, I'm an app developer. I think your book would." And we started talking, and we struck. So we got a business relationship. We created an LLC. I provided the content. He provided the technical. It's the state of the art smartphone app on climate change. There's nothing that approaches it. Nothing. And we got it up. We got it out. I went down on the. Went down and rolled it out actually on the Glenn Beck show. Went down to Mercury Studios in Dallas, rolled it out on that. Had a half an hour. Glenn Beck loves the app, and 2 days later, Apple removed it from the App Store.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I've got a lot of contacts with. So the Daily Signal from Heritage Foundation the next day wrote a story about it, and it was their lead story that day. They've got 24 million subscribers, and Drudge picked it up. It was the number one story on Drudge for 24 hours. Get that? It was about Apple removing Greg's app from the App Store, and I was on Laura Ingraham that night, One American News. I was on Tucker Carlson the next night, and the book sales just exploded. We were,
wow.
It was the number one, and since that time, this was a little over a year ago. We've been number one bestseller on Amazon in a couple of categories, off and on, mostly on, and we're down a little bit now, but. So it was the best thing that ever happened, and then so I just we used that just to push the book sales, and it did, and it was an incredible story, and we ended up getting the app is available now. It was kind of funny. They said that it lacked compelling content. Holy crap!
Wow.
If you look at if you go on your iPhone or the App Store and look for climate change apps, they have 20 or 30 or 40 of these things that look like failed middle school science fair projects. With, I mean, these are seriously. I mean, I've got I have a niece that's in 6th grade that could do a better job creating an app than what some of these things were. And they said mine lacked compelling content. Really?
Wow.
And it was a blatant, and of course the name of my book is Inconvenient Facts, the Science That Al Gore Doesn't Want You to Know. And I'm going to let you guess what ex-vice president of the United States sits on Apple's board of directors.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, 1, 2, 3.
Yeah,
Al Gore.
Of course. Yep.
And so it's been, and then we use that, and we had my local library. Okay, so it's a best-selling book. My local library is a mile and a half up the road. They banned my book, and we're like,
Jeez.
Really? You've got a best-selling author in your district. How many others? Name one that you have a best-selling author in your district. How many others? None. Well, but yeah, and they banned my books. Of course, that also got put up. The Daily Signal from Heritage Foundation. You're familiar with Heritage, I'm sure.
Sure am. Yep.
Yeah, Daily Signal. If you don't, it's a great. If you haven't signed up for it, you should. Great summary every morning to get up to information. Again, they featured that story about local library censors local geologist book, which again drove sales through the roof. So
I just have to comment here because I find the most troubling and the most dangerous part of all of this discussion, and it could be said of the coronavirus discussion, is this effort to silence one side of the argument. That to me, and you mentioned Apple pulling your app. I just heard Facebook is taking down any Facebook posts that talk about organizing protests against what governments are doing. Which is a constitutionally protected right, and it's the top of the list. It's the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, and Facebook has decided that is misinformation and bad news or whatever they call it. They're taking those things down. We know that Google influences the types of search responses you get depending on what you type in. We know that YouTube filters certain videos. This video will be filtered when it's posted tomorrow. It won't get the response and the search results that it should because of the title that it'll have. That is the most troubling part of this whole discussion, is this effort to silence anybody who has a dissenting opinion. It's unbelievable to me. Yeah,
it is. And, my wife and I went down to our local Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania protest yesterday, and the signs on both sides of our truck. It said, "I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees." And, we've got an overreaching government that's trying to shut us all down.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be essential versus non-essential. It should be safe versus unsafe. And I just, for the first, and our governor, well, actually our transgender attorney, Surgeon General for Pennsylvania, just enacted forced wearing of face masks, and I wore my first face mask today, and I just
I'm not going to say
I'm telling you what, I don't make a very darn good sheep. I'm not.
I'm not either. I'm not either, and I'm not going to tell you that it's a bad idea to wear a face mask, but I am going to tell you I'm not going to accept someone ordering me to. There's nothing in the Constitution that gives them that authority. But anyway, we could go on about that for another hour, and we don't have a lot of time left. What happens when these scientists and these politicians offer these benchmarks? we've seen these dates come and go. You know, in the year 2000, ocean levels are going to rise 6 inches, and Manhattan's going to be underwater. These things come and go all the time. They come and go, and they don't happen. How do these people justify that? And do they just reset the dates on this stuff?
They do, and it's one of the examples I gave in my book was that in 2005 the UN said that there would be 50 million climate refugees by the year 2010. Well, 2010 came and went, and of course there weren't any. And I published my book, and we looked at they identified the highest risk communities, and they listed 5 island nations. And I looked, and the population of those island nations had exploded. The census data from whenever they did there in 2005 to 2015 had exploded completely. And so people were flocking to these at-risk islands, not fleeing from them. And then in 2015, they issued the same 50 million climate refugees by 2020. Well, it's 2020, and none of those same island. I haven't looked at the census data, but I'm sure their populations are still expanding. So they keep people. They just think that people will just ignore them. They're I don't know.
Yeah,
it's I have great faith. I think the truth will win out, is what I think. And I think that they're overreaching by some of these things. The latest was we didn't get into all. There was so much we didn't talk about, but the latest climate hoax was this thing about mega droughts. The worst mega drought in the southwest United States is occurring for the last 2,000 years, when in fact just the opposite is occurring. And just we have the climate hoax about mass extinctions.
I want to talk about that for a second, because for a while, until this coronavirus took over all the headlines, this Greta Thunberg was the darling of that particular argument and that side, and she gave a very emotional speech, in which who knows, I don't know, but first of all, was she right about anything? And secondly, why her? What about her makes her such an authority on all this?
Well, she's not an authority. She's a compelling figure. There's some people that just rise up at the right time, and she was one of those people that had a voice. I think she's being funded by who knows who. I don't know, but every time she opens her mouth lately, she's talking about mass extinctions occurring. And I took a look at that. There was a United States House of Representatives held a hearing on that. Mark Morano and Patrick Moore were testified. I wish I had been there, but they used my analysis of this. Mark Morano and both Patrick Moore used my analysis of mass extinctions to dispute this. And what we found was that the UN report alleging mass extinctions was just... Again, you can go to my website at inconvenientfacts.xyz to find out about this, about the mass extinctions. I looked at the exact same data they did and found that extinctions peaked in the late 1800s, and they've been in decline ever since, significant decline ever since. Because in the late 1800s, we did a lot of exploration of the people were in the Caribbean and the Pacific Islands were landing, and rats and invasive species were taking over and just killing all kinds of species that were vulnerable to these populations of whatever they were. But we've been in extinction. Now, in the UN report, they claim that there would be 1 million extinctions over the next several decades. Would it get to 1 million extinctions in that time frame? You'd need 25,000 to 30,000 extinctions per year. You know what it's been for the last 40 years? What the average? We needed 25,000 to 30,000 extinctions per year. It's been 2, not 200, not 2,000, 2 extinctions per year over the last 40 years. Really? that's just an example of how they abuse and misuse data. It's an abuse of the scientific process is what it is, and that's just one grand example of the abuse of the scientific process. And as a scientist, it outrages me that they do this and they get away with it. And it's horrific what they do.
What about
the lies? And if we just look at California, the California fires is another great example. We're being told, everybody thinks that fires are increasing because of global warming. The fact of the matter is the number of fires in California has declined by almost 50% over the last 40 years, and nobody knows it. Now, the area burned has increased, but again, that's a forest management project problem. The number of fires in California have declined 50% in the last 40 years. Who knew that? You didn't know that, did you?
Right. No, of course not. Did not.
Yeah.
And
it's just stuff like that. I'm sorry. I get irate.
It's okay.
About this.
This is important information. It's the same thing. We're told that extreme weather events are more common, more frequent, like hurricanes, tornadoes. Is there any truth to that? That these things are more frequent?
Absolutely not. The extreme weather deaths related to extreme weather, has declined 98% since the 1920s. 98%. Now, again, a lot of that has to do with prediction and making sure that the things that. But it's completely opposite of what we're being told, and we're being told that it's. Oh, I can just in my book I document the last half of my book, or what I call climate apocalypse, or these each one. I take a look at each one of these climate apocalypse events to show that it's just the science shows that it's absolutely opposite of what we're being told. You and your listeners are being lied to. You're being lied to about supposed horrific events related to climate change. And it's just not so. It's not.
What about the Green New Deal? We keep hearing about this. The parts of Congress seem to keep wanting to slip it into some of these COVID stimulus or recovery or assistance bills that are here. And I'm also very, very concerned that now that we've opened this door for mayors, governors, and even a president to issue unconstitutional orders and mandates because of a quote-unquote scientific phenomena, such as a virus, that they might use those same arguments to do something that would maybe ban SUVs because of global warming. I mean, do you see that threat?
Yeah, there was this recent webinar that was just April 2nd. They were talking about how we need to message, the media needs to message climate change in an era of COVID-19, and that's what they were talking about. And they need, and what we're going to see, and you've had some predictions you've heard that haven't turned out to be true by COVID-19. I'll tell you one thing that will be true: they're going to be an all-out massive assault linking COVID-19 to climate change, and how look what we were able to do. We were able to act in time. Thank God we were able to do this to save the Earth from hundreds of millions of deaths or whatever it is from COVID-19. We have the same existential threat with climate change, and we have to act now. We can't wait for it to occur. We have to act now to prevent this from occurring because it's just as dangerous as COVID-19. There's going to be a lot of messaging you're going to hear. We heard it from the Pope last week when he equated COVID-19. He said it was the result of the Earth's response to our abuses of the Earth, which is basically paganism.
Wow.
I mean, this is not Christian theology. This is paganism, what he was talking about. basically an Earth Mother that's responding to the abuses of the Earth that we're doing, and it's just these people have to be. There's going to be an onslaught of linkage of everything and anything that's unusual in terms of weather to climate change, because they want to equate that to the COVID-19 and the horrors that we've had. And I'm not sure they're horrors, but we can talk about whether this is, we're going to look back in hindsight to find out how better or worse or horrific this COVID-19 is as compared to other flus. I think it's too early to assess that right now. It looks, I'm very concerned about it, and I'm doing things to alleviate. But we're going to know more in a few weeks or a few months, and we'll be able to assess at that time. But the big thing here is this co-equivalence between climate change threats and COVID-19, and it's going to be, you're going to hear a lot about that.
We're going to have to bring this conversation home because we're almost out of time. So let's kind of put it in a nutshell here. If, in fact, there was a reduction, if there was a global reduction or maybe just an American reduction in CO2 emissions, how much of a difference would that make to the temperature that in the temperature trends?
Okay. Well, if the United States, according to the Magic Simulator, I've got that on my website too, if we reduced 100% of our emissions, we would avert 0.04 of a degree Celsius by the year 2050.
If we eliminated 100% of our CO2 emissions?
100%.
So we got rid of it all.
Yeah.
We would see what difference now?
0.04 of a degree.
0.04 of a degree. Wow.
So if you look at, and I brought that up at I had a debate with a Penn State professor, Dr. James Casting. I brought that up at the end of our argument, and he said, well, yeah, that's true, but he admitted it was true, but we all have to work together to, the China and India and all. We all have. Well, do you think China and India are going to draw back on their CO2 emissions voluntarily?
Not a
Heck
chance.
no. There's no way. And so there's no way they're going to do that.
Wow. The book is available where, Greg?
Yeah, it's easiest to go to Amazon. Most people buy it through Amazon. It's Inconvenient Facts. I wrote this for non-scientists. I wrote this as I wanted a book. It's fully illustrated, color 90 plus color, high quality diagrams and figures in it. And I gave a talk in West Virginia at the Romney Tea Party, Romney, West Virginia. Fellow setting up my for me. He says he was setting stuff up ready for my talk. He said, "Mr. Wrightstone," he said, and he had his sleeves cut off. It looked like he came right out from under a truck. And he says, "Mr. Wrightstone," he says, "I just loved your book." And he said, "It's the first book I've read since high school." And I said, "Oh my God, I've been successful." That this guy, and he says, "I just loved it." And that's what I wanted. And it's not that it's dumbed down, but I wrote it for the non-scientists in an understandable way that they could grasp. So it makes a great gift. Good time to buy one with everybody being holed up in their homes.
For sure. Again, the book is titled Inconvenient Facts. The website is inconvenientfacts.xyz. Author and our guest tonight, Gregory Wrightstone. We appreciate you being here, Greg. It was a fantastic and stimulating discussion. I'm going to put you on the short list. Love to have you come back again.
Right, Roger that.
Beyond Reality Paranormal is hosted by JV Johnson and produced by Orion Palmer and Slick Eddie Edwards. Like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Please consider supporting the program either through your podcast platform, click on the link in the description, or on Patreon at Joha Productions. If you'd like to be a guest on Beyond Reality Paranormal, or you have a recommendation for a guest, contact our producer, Slick Eddie Edwards. Eddie is spelled with a Y at slickeddieedwards@gmail.com.